Welcome to Philosophy in a Nutshell, a new chapter in the Classics Unraveled repertoire. I am Jon Christianson, and this is the part where we talk about the PRESOCRATICS. We're going to take an aside from our typical Classics Unraveled fare to try and solve the problem of philosophy. If you're anything like me, when you hear the word philosophy used by ordinary people, they're usually using it in this very unrigorous, kind of makes you think, doesn't it, sort of way. I want to take the names and the terms and the ideas that you may have heard thrown around now and then and put them where they belong so that you can use philosophy correctly and become a philosopher yourself. To begin, why don't we define what we mean when we say philosophy? The word itself is a combination of philo and sophia. It means love of wisdom. But more specifically, philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom and understanding. Now, beyond just thinking about people pacing around some Greek public square and thinking about heady metaphysical ideas, this also included what we'd typically brand as the sciences. In fact, up until relatively recently, the correct way of talking about the sciences was natural philosophy. In fact, if you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Frankenstein doesn't call himself a scientist, he calls himself a natural philosopher. So the range of topics relevant to philosophy is anything that has to do with knowledge and a deep and thorough understanding of how the world works, whether material or immaterial, whether concrete or divine. That means a philosopher is just someone using his intellect to try and understand the world around him. And the world around him in the pre-philosophical period was a world that needed some untangling. Oftentimes, we classical folk kind of look at ancient things as good things. The older, the better. But if you go far enough back on the timeline, eventually things are going to be pretty bad. Simply put, in the pre-classical and pre-philosophical world, a lot of things that we take for granted were not generally known or not generally assumed. This is an age of might makes right, where if a barbarian horde comes marching over the hill and takes your land, it's their land now. There's not much you're going to be able to do about it. But also, there's not much vocabulary you can use or intellectual laws you can apply that suggest that that land is yours in some fundamental way. Something like ethics did not exist at this time beyond a general sense of, hey, no fair. So we need to give this ancient world a sense of continuity, a sense of permanence, right? But also an explanation for the impermanence that they see in the world. We need to explain how something material can be subject to something immaterial, like an idea or a principle. So our early philosophers, the PRESOCRATICS, are going to try and solve that for us. Can we find the link between the material and the immaterial world? And can we understand what parts of our universe are permanent and what parts are changing? We first start getting answers to these questions in Miletus, which is basically a Greek-speaking part of Western Turkey. And it's this Milesian school that gives us Thales. Thales is basically a figure of prehistory. We don't know a lot about him. The only writings we have of his are quotations of quotations by later authors. But he's the first person that we know of who began looking at the world not on the basis of the gods make it so, or the barbarian hordes make it so, but on the basis of trying to find an underlying principle to the physical world, right? Something that makes everything abide by a common rule or a common ancestor. In fact, his main search was for what was called the Arche, or the beginning or the ruling thing. The idea was that if everything belongs or everything originates from a single source and is composed of the same matter, then perhaps the world therefore has some kind of lineage, some kind of cause and effect that can be traced reliably into the past and into the future. What is the governing source, the originating source of all things, according to Thales? Water. Now, water in a literal sense makes enough sense to an ancient, perhaps. Again, the water is the place from which islands arise. Moisture is the substance from which life arises. He might have meant it metaphorically, too, as a description of the joining and separating of physical substances. But we assume he meant it literally. And on that literal basis, we know better than Thales. Water isn't the source of all things. But identifying an arche makes Thales the beginner of a long historical quest to find the source of permanence, the source of intelligibility in the universe. And while later philosophers will absolutely discard water as the choice, they will use the same architecture, the same idea of something is the source, something is the governor, to characterize a great deal of future work. The philosopher Nietzsche famously says this about Thales. He says, Greek philosophy seems to begin with an absurd notion, with the proposition that water is the primal origin and the womb of all things. Is it really necessary for us to take serious notice of this proposition? It is, and for three reasons. First, because it tells us something about the primal origin of all things. Second, because it does so in a language devoid of fable and myth. And finally, because contained in it, if only embryonically, is the thought that all things are one. Additionally, Thales suggested that all things are full of gods, which, once again, we assume he means literally. He seems to have been a proponent of a sort of early animism, the idea that everything has a spirit of some kind in it. For example, Aristotle quotes Thales as using magnets as an example of the spiritual ability of one thing to operate on another thing. We don't think magnets are spirits or gods. But once again, Thales begins an early suggestion that physical objects, physical things, have some kind of underlying immaterial principle, and that those immaterial components of physical objects, physical beings, are in some way more powerful or more permanent than their physical, corruptible counterparts. So, take him or leave him, Thales is the great-granddaddy of the Milesian school, and the first person to begin poking and prodding us towards an objective view of reality. However, if Thales is the founder of the Milesian school, then Pythagoras would be its esteemed dropout. You probably know Pythagoras from the Pythagorean theorem, and indeed, Pythagoras was a huge fan of math. But people in the ancient world typically didn't know him for his mathematics. Well, they did know him for that, but mostly as the founder and leader of a religious group, a religious community or cult that was based in Western Turkey and Greece. The Pythagoreans famously followed a very insular, a very monastic way of life that involved these strange initiation rituals and a number of life restrictions, such as dietary restrictions. They famously were very leery about beans. This may have something to do with their belief in metempsychosis, which is a fancy Greek word for reincarnation, the transmigration of souls. Pythagoras famously told this story about hearing the sound of someone beating a dog somewhere in the city, and that he heard in the voice of the dog the voice of his dead and departed friend. And because he recognized that his friend, now a dog, was being beaten, he went to the dog's rescue and prevented the man from doing so. Say what you will about that transmigration of souls, that metempsychosis. It suggests, once again, like Thales, that Pythagoras believed in an immaterial component of the person. But unlike Thales, the belief in a transmigrating soul suggests that that immaterial component of a person is in fact more durable and superior to the physical and corruptible part. And in fact, that if anything is the arche, if anything is the underlying and governing principle of all things, that it's not water, it's not something physical, but rather something non-physical, something spiritual. His arche, Pythagoras' arche, was number. We were going to get back to mathematics eventually. The Pythagoreans were famously in love with numbers and looked for numerical relationships between everything. Some of those relationships they found were actually quite profound, especially in the realm of music. For example, if you take the frequency of any musical note and then you raise that note an octave, the frequency will double. And if you drop it an octave, it'll be halved. And every major harmony that that note can have will be some very precise mathematical fraction of that frequency, such that music can be described as an entirely mathematical process. From there, he goes on to astronomy, where if you've heard of the music of the spheres, that's not talking about actual music up in the heavens, but rather these very precise numerical intervals of the frequency of orbits of each planet relative to each other and relative to the Earth. Remember, they did think that the Earth was the center at this time. Eventually, the Pythagoreans go into, well, weird religious territory with their number thing. They begin saying that marriage is governed by the number 5, for example, because man is governed by the number 2 and woman is governed by the number 3, which has a lot less obvious objective basis than, say, the whole music of the spheres thing. However, we do have from Pythagoras a leading away from a physical arche, from a material beginning and governor of all things, to an immaterial governor and originator of all things. And it's this immaterial arche that is going to give the later and, we could say, more important philosophers something to hang their hat on. By the time the Milesian school branches out and becomes the Ionian school of philosophers, they're going to start looking for that arche, that source, by very different roads. Perhaps the most unusual of these being Heraclitus, or Heraclitus the Obscure. He famously would only ever utter any meaningful philosophical work in these short, pithy utterances, the way an oracle might propound something. Perhaps his most famous such maxim would be "everything flows," which is basically his mission statement for his whole philosophy. His arche was not some specific fixed thing, but rather change itself. There is nothing permanent. There's no such thing as a fixed object, but simply a series of objects that flow from one to another, undergoing change. In the words of Heraclitus, you cannot step into the same river twice. In fact, the arche of Heraclitus is fire, which is something that by its very definition is a process. It's the combustion or transformation of one set of things to another set of things. And most importantly, it suggests a certain directionality of the universe. Let me explain what I mean by that. In describing his arche, Heraclitus said that fire is surfeit and want. That it's not just a process of part A to part B, but rather part A yearning to become or striving to become part B. This is unique and new because the previous philosophers have given us an origin point. Heraclitus is the first person to try taking that origin and bring it to a conclusion, an end, a purpose. It's this purpose-driven philosophy that allows Heraclitus to say something like, justice is strife. That seems wrong on the face of it, right? We think of justice as this happy status quo. But Heraclitus is saying the world is changed. There's no such thing as a status quo or otherwise. And so justice is merely striving towards, reaching towards that better state. And if philosophy is governed not by what things are, or what things have been, or what things will be, but about the process in between, then suddenly the idea of ethics, the idea not of right state, but of right action, becomes open to us. Heraclitus gives us a problem. If we believe that the whole world is governed by change, then what room is left for permanent things? Can anything last forever? Our solution comes from Democritus, who says that if things are changing constantly on the macroscopic, then perhaps permanence can be found on the microscopic. That's right, Democritus was the developer of the atom, or at least the philosophical atom. You probably heard in school that some ancient Democritus came up with the atom because anything that's divisible can be divided, can be divided, can be divided until it can't be divided anymore. That's an extrapolation of the philosophical atom, but the point is more this. Change happens not in the atoms themselves, but in the arrangement of atoms. That change can be a description of movement, impermanent movement, of permanent units. And so Heraclitus isn't wrong with suggesting that the world is in constant flux, and yet you can still allow for a truly permanent, a truly eternal thing. Now, using the physical, indivisible atom as your arche, as the thing that literally makes up all things, leads us to some issues. For example, Democritus believed that everything immaterial was actually created of atoms. That includes souls, that includes gods, and that meant that while more permanent than human beings, gods, just like every changing thing, would eventually die away, and that even our souls would eventually die away. On the other hand, the atoms themselves are not going anywhere, and so the universe will keep on chugging along forever, regardless of whether there's anyone living in it. Which leads Democritus and his followers to a surprisingly materialistic description of the world. By materialistic, I don't mean in the sense of a shopaholic, I mean in the sense of believing that there is no such thing as an immaterial world. That the solution to the physical-spiritual conundrum is that one of those is fake. This flies in the face of everything we've said so far. And Democritus can really be thought of as the first opponent to the through line of Western philosophy so far. And even though future philosophers will borrow heavily from his ideas, because indeed, the whole atom idea is not wrong, necessarily those who like those ideas will have to make them come to terms with a seemingly spiritualized world. If Democritus is our absolute materialist, then our absolute immaterialist is Parmenides. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I do not like Parmenides very much. Parmenides is like that one friend in college who sits back and says, "Do you think that this might all be a simulation, man?" And you kind of have to just abide by it, because if you say no, then he'll say, well, maybe that's just the simulation telling you so. The arche of Parmenides is the one, unity, the complete lack of variety in any respect. And he does mean that quite literally. And that's it. Describing it any further, giving it a name besides one, unity, would be to suggest that it has some feature or has some traits. But no, Parmenides says, any traits or words that we have to describe the things that make one thing like another are in fact fantasy, and that the observable differences between one object and the other, hey, the idea that there is one object and another, is in fact entirely illusion. In other words, the world as we know it is merely a dreamland, and that the true world, the world stripped away of any kind of illusion or misunderstanding by human observers, is that there's no such thing as human observers. There's no such thing as anything you see and feel and taste, but rather a single, unified, featureless sphere with nothing outside of it and nothing different within it. So our job as philosophers, says Parmenides, is merely to distance ourselves from the way of belief, the way of looking at the world in all of its variety, and recognizing that the true world, the way of truth, is in fact the recognition and contemplation of the absolute, of the unified, and of the featureless sphere. And that's about all I can say about Parmenides. I would be happy to be corrected that Parmenides has something a little bit better to offer us. But as far as I can tell, it really just reduces down to this absolute unifying and uniforming principle where all stuff, all things, plural, are in fact illusions. The problem with Parmenides was there was more of him. Parmenides had a student named Zeno, who we call the father of dialectics. Dialectics are not a philosophical position, but a philosophical method or tool. In other words, the use of language, the use of argumentation to arrive at better conclusions. The tool of choice for Zeno was the reductio ad absurdum, a dialectical method of taking an opponent's argument and pursuing it to its logical conclusion to hopefully demonstrate that that logical conclusion is not so logical at all. This is necessarily a tool of negation, which is great for Zeno because Zeno believes that there's no variety, and so all he needs to do is to negate every variety. But later on, this reductio ad absurdum, this dialectical method, will allow us to reduce ourselves down to a blank slate, a position from which we can develop a perfectly pure and perfectly new philosophical foundation. So, as much as I don't like Parmenides, and as much as Zeno irks me in what they have to say, how they say it is in fact one of the most important contributions of the PRESOCRATICS to philosophy, and that reductio ad absurdum will be one of the favorite tools of the first true great philosopher, Plato. As you can see, this pre-Socratic period was mostly a process of throwing things at the wall and seeing what stuck. The arche is water, it's fire, it's change, it's the sphere, it's number. Change is possible, change is impossible. Eternity is possible, eternity is impossible. Pretty much every possible position was taken at some point during this time. Look at all of them together and it's all discord and disagreement. But if you look at each one of them, you can see that they all had something to contribute to what would eventually become a stronger and more complete universal philosophy. So, what now? Next time, we're going to look at Plato, who finally gives us a single philosophy that seems not to have any major seams the way his predecessors do. Thank you for watching this episode of Philosophy in a Nutshell with Classics Unraveled. If you liked this episode, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing and all the YouTube stuff. I am Jon Christianson. Fare thee well.